The German shepherd sat perfectly still beside Sarah Martinez, both of them watching the approaching police cruiser with its lights flashing. Karen Williams, the HOA president, gesticulated wildly to the responding officers, her designer yoga pants and perfectly highlighted hair a stark contrast to her red, angry face. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she fingered the police badge in her pocket. After 6 months of calculated harassment from the HOA president, the moment she'd been patiently waiting for had finally arrived. Her eyes drifted to her front yard. Immaculate as always, the grass precisely regulation height, not a single violation in sight. Rex hadn't moved a muscle, his training evident in every line of his body. She could almost hear Karen's shrill voice carrying across the morning air. "That dog is dangerous. He tried to attack me. I demand something be done immediately." Sarah took a deep breath, savoring the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and the impending justice. Sometimes the best victories came to those who waited. 3 months earlier, Sarah had stood in this same spot watching the moving truck pull away from her new home in Maple Grove Estates. The neighborhood screamed upper middle-class perfection. Coordinated mailboxes, identical lawn ornaments, and houses that varied only in their subtle shades of beige and gray. Her modest ranch-style home stood out only in its military precision of maintenance, a habit she'd carried over from her years in law enforcement. The welcome to the neighborhood basket had arrived that morning, filled with local business pamphlets, HOA guidelines, highlighted in several places, and a handwritten note reminding her of the upcoming property inspection. The message was clear: conform or face consequences. Rex padded silently around their new backyard, his keen nose taking in every detail. To the casual observer, he was just a well-trained pet. Only Sarah knew he was actually recovering from a minor surgery, taking a brief medical leave from their canine unit duties. She'd chosen this neighborhood specifically for its quiet atmosphere, perfect for his recovery. The whispers had started almost immediately. She caught fragments of conversations. Single woman, Hispanic, in this neighborhood? And concerned glances at Rex. Such a large dog. Are those even allowed? Sarah documented everything, a habit from years of police work. Experience had taught her that small prejudices often grew into larger problems. The doorbell rang exactly 1 week after move-in. Sarah opened it to find a woman who could have stepped out of a suburban HOA president casting call. Perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive athleisure wear, and a clipboard held like a weapon. "Welcome to Maple Grove Estates." Karen Williams' smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Williams, HOA president. I trust you've received our community guidelines?" "Yes, thank you." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, developed through years of tense encounters. "I've reviewed them thoroughly." Karen's pen hovered over her clipboard as her eyes darted around, hunting for violations. "We pride ourselves on maintaining very high standards here. Our property values depend on strict adherence to—" The words died in her throat as Rex appeared silently in the doorway. Sarah watched Karen's perfectly manicured hand tighten on her clipboard, her smile becoming brittle. "Oh my, that's quite a large dog." Karen's pen scratched against paper. "You are aware of our pet restrictions, aren't you? We have very specific guidelines about aggressive breeds. Rex is fully certified and compliant with all local ordinances." Sarah replied simply, letting Karen draw her own conclusions about what kind of certification she meant. "Yes, well—" Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll need to review his documentation at the next board meeting. And of course, any aggressive behavior will be grounds for immediate action." Sarah nodded politely, already recognizing the signs of trouble ahead. "I understand completely. Rex's behavior won't be a problem." As Karen turned to leave, her parting words carried a clear threat. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Ms. Martinez. I'll be keeping a close eye on things to ensure everyone's safety." Sarah closed the door, her hand automatically reaching to scratch behind Rex's ears. "Well, partner," she murmured, "looks like we've got ourselves a situation." Rex's ear twitched in response, both of them knowing this was just the beginning. Sarah was reviewing security footage when the first official HOA notice arrived. The envelope contained a meticulously detailed citation about her grass length, supposedly 1/4 inch above regulation. Attached were photos of Karen Williams herself measuring the grass with a ruler at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. "Really, partner?" Sarah murmured to Rex, who lay at her feet. "Midnight lawn measurements?" She added the notice to her growing documentation file, already thick with notes about random property inspections and complaints about Rex. The following week brought a citation for a garden hose visible from the street, though only from the specific angle where Karen had stationed herself for 20 minutes to take photos. Sarah's security cameras had caught that performance too. At that month's HOA meeting, Karen made a point of discussing recent property maintenance issues while staring directly at Sarah. "We simply cannot allow our standards to slip," she declared to the assembled homeowners. "Some newer residents may need additional guidance to understand our community values." Sarah sat quietly, taking notes on her laptop. Next to each of Karen's complaints, she documented the 3 other houses with similar violations that received no citations. Her law enforcement training served her well. Every incident was time-stamped, photographed, and cross-referenced. By midsummer, Karen's campaign had escalated. Anonymous complaints about Rex's aggressive barking began flooding the HOA office, despite Sarah's security footage showing he rarely made a sound. Karen started hosting impromptu HOA emergency meetings about pet safety, carefully never naming Sarah directly, but making pointed references to dangerous animals in the community. "Did you see that beast lunge at Mrs. Peterson?" Sarah overheard Karen telling a group of neighbors. She checked her footage later. The lunge was Rex calmly sitting as an elderly neighbor dropped her mail, waiting for Sarah's command before helping retrieve it. The pressure began affecting Sarah's daily routine. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid passing her house. Others gave her sympathetic looks but kept their distance, afraid of drawing Karen's attention. A few, however, began reaching out privately. "She did the same thing to us last year," confided Mary Chen from 3 doors down. "Kept filing complaints about our unauthorized modifications. We had installed a wheelchair ramp for my mother. We finally had to get a lawyer." Sarah thanked them for sharing, adding each story to her growing file. Her years working with the K-9 unit had taught her the value of patience and precise timing. In her home office, Sarah studied the pattern emerging from her collected evidence. Karen's harassment followed a predictable escalation. First citations for minor infractions, then anonymous complaints, followed by attempts to rally community opposition. It was textbook intimidation, and Sarah recognized they were approaching the breaking point. She began preparing systematically. Every interaction was recorded from multiple angles. Each complaint was answered with professional courtesy while being added to her documentation of discriminatory enforcement. Her chain of command was kept informed, and the department's legal team helped her prepare for various scenarios. "Getting close now, aren't we?" she said to Rex during their evening security check. He tilted his head, alert as always. They both heard Karen's car slow down as it passed the house, the 3rd drive-by that evening. The next HOA meeting brought the shift Sarah had been expecting. Karen stood at the podium, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. "We have received multiple reports of an aggressive animal threatening residents," she announced. "The board will be taking immediate action to protect our community." Sarah continued typing calmly as frightened murmurs spread through the room. In her notes, she added, "Potential trigger event approaching. Review contingency plans with legal team." That night, Karen's car made 5 more passes by the house. Sarah's cameras caught her taking photos with a telephoto lens, presumably hoping to document some violation. Rex watched from the window, his posture relaxed but alert. "Almost time, partner," Sarah told him, reviewing her preparation checklist one more time. "She's going to make her move soon, and we'll be ready." The next morning brought another envelope. This one marked "Urgent Civilization Notice" in bold red letters. Sarah added it to her file without opening it. All the pieces were in place now. She just had to wait for Karen to make one final, critical mistake. An official-looking envelope arrived at the police department's K-9 unit office on a Tuesday morning. Inside was a formal complaint about a dangerous animal at Sarah's address, with Karen's signature prominently displayed at the bottom. Sarah added it to her now substantial evidence file, noting how the complaint carefully avoided mentioning her by name while including multiple references to community safety and aggressive breed characteristics. The responding officer assigned to the complaint, Detective James Rodriguez, could barely keep a straight face as he reviewed it. "She really has no idea, does she?" he asked, watching Rex demonstrate his latest training exercise with perfect precision. "Not yet," Sarah replied, her voice carefully neutral. "But she's escalating faster now. This is the 3rd complaint she's filed with different agencies this week." The HOA's lawyers had also started sending threatening letters about covenant violations and legal remedies. Each one joined Sarah's growing documentation, carefully organized by date, type, and escalation level. Her own legal team had reviewed everything, confirming she was perfectly positioned for what would come next. Karen's campaign had divided the neighborhood into clear factions. A core group of her supporters now openly crossed themselves when passing Sarah's house, as if warding off evil. Others had begun avoiding the street entirely, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire of Karen's crusade. But there were quiet allies, too. Mrs. Chen from down the street had started documenting her own observations of Karen's behavior. Mr. Thompson, a retired judge, had discreetly offered his perspective on the legal aspects of HOA overreach. Even teenage Bobby Wilson had provided copies of social media posts where Karen encouraged neighbors to file complaints about Rex. The tension reached new heights at the emergency HOA meeting Karen called on a sweltering Thursday evening. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Karen took the podium, her face flushed with anticipated triumph. "We are facing a crisis," she declared, shuffling her papers importantly. "Our peaceful community is being threatened by a dangerous element that must be removed immediately." Her eyes fixed on Sarah, sitting quietly in the back row. "We have documented numerous instances of aggressive behavior, property violations, and threats to community safety." Sarah continued taking notes, her face professionally blank, as Karen displayed a series of blurry photographs. "These images clearly show the threat we're facing," Karen continued, though the photos showed nothing more than Rex calmly sitting in Sarah's yard or walking perfectly healed on their morning runs. The meeting erupted into chaos when Karen announced her masterstroke. "The board has voted to implement emergency measures. Animal control will be arriving tomorrow morning to remove the dangerous animal, and we have obtained a preliminary injunction requiring immediate compliance." She waved a official-looking document triumphantly, either not noticing or choosing to ignore how Sarah's subtle smile never wavered. Several neighbors gasped. Others looked uncomfortable. A few seemed quietly pleased. Later that night, Sarah's security cameras caught Karen and 2 board members doing a victory lap past her house, pointing and laughing. She added the footage to her file, then made 3 important phone calls. "Everything's ready," she told Rex as they did their final security check. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting, partner." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sarah, dressed with particular care, making sure her uniform was perfectly pressed. Rex sat watching her, his posture alert but relaxed, as she attached his official K-9 unit vest and badges. Right on schedule, 2 animal control vehicles pulled up outside, followed quickly by Karen and an enthusiastic audience of her supporters. Sarah stepped onto her porch, Rex at perfect attention beside her, and waited for the show to begin. Karen's face glowed with vindictive pleasure as she approached, waving her documents. "We warned you this would happen. You have no choice but to—" Her voice died as she finally registered Sarah's attire, her eyes widening as they tracked from the police uniform to the K-9 unit patches to Rex's official vest. The animal control officers were already heading back to their vehicles, trying to hide their amusement. One called over his shoulder, "Sorry for the confusion, Officer Martinez. We didn't realize this was about Rex." Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she fingered her badge. "No problem at all. I believe Mrs. Williams here might have forgotten to mention a few relevant details in her complaint." Karen Williams stood frozen on Sarah's perfectly manicured lawn, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she struggled to process the scene before her. The morning sun glinted off Sarah's badge and Rex's K-9 unit vest, while the retreating animal control officers' barely concealed laughter drifted through the stunned silence. "There must be some mistake," Karen finally managed, her voice climbing an octave. "You can't be. I mean, this isn't—" She clutched her stack of HOA violations like a shield. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, developed through years of tense police encounters. "Officer Sarah Martinez, K-9 unit. And this is Rex, my partner." She gestured to the German Shepherd sitting alertly beside her. "I believe you've filed several complaints about him." The gathering crowd of neighbors murmured as understanding dawned. Mrs. Chen was recording everything on her phone while Mr. Thompson, the retired judge, watched with unconcealed amusement. But the HOA regulations clearly state—" Karen started, waving her papers. "Perhaps we should review those regulations," Sarah suggested calmly, retrieving a folder from inside, "along with some other documentation I've been collecting." Karen's face paled as Sarah began methodically laying out 6 months of evidence. Security footage of late-night yard measurements, documentation of selective enforcement, recorded conversations of Karen encouraging false complaints, and copies of every discriminatory action taken against Sarah's property. "You've been documenting everything?" Karen's voice wavered. "It's standard procedure," Sarah replied. "Just like it's standard procedure to file charges against individuals who knowingly make false reports to law enforcement and animal control." She paused meaningfully. "Those are serious offenses, Mrs. Williams." The crowd had grown larger now, including several board members who were suddenly very interested in their phones. Karen's supporters had begun quietly backing away, leaving her increasingly isolated on the lawn. I never intended." Karen's designer yoga pants were getting grass stains as she shifted nervously from foot to foot. "This is just a misunderstanding about HOA regulations." "Is it?" Sarah's voice remained professional but took on a harder edge. "Because I have documented evidence of you filing false reports with multiple agencies, encouraging neighbors to file false complaints, and engaging in targeted harassment. Would you like me to continue listing potential charges?" The color drained from Karen's face as the full implications hit her. Her carefully constructed position of power was crumbling, and her audience was witnessing every moment. "The thing about being in law enforcement," Sarah continued, her tone conversational, "is that it teaches you patience. Sometimes you have to wait for people to reveal their true intentions before you can act." She gestured to her evidence file. "And you've given me quite a lot to work with, Mrs. Williams." Karen's lawyer arrived 20 minutes later, looking harried. By then, Sarah had finished outlining exactly how many legal violations Karen had committed in her campaign of harassment. The HOA board members present had already begun distancing themselves, frantically whispering about emergency meetings and bylaw revisions. "Officer Martinez," Karen's lawyer said after reviewing the evidence, "perhaps we could discuss this privately." His expression suggested he knew exactly how much trouble his client was in. Sarah nodded. "Of course, though I should mention that the Department's Civil Rights Division is very interested in reviewing these incidents." She paused. "They've been looking for a test case about discriminatory HOA enforcement." The implications hung in the morning air as Karen was led away by her lawyer, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The remaining neighbors lingered, many approaching Sarah to share their own stories of Karen's previous harassment campaigns. "You knew all along," Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head in admiration. "You were just waiting for her to go too far." Sarah scratched Rex behind the ears as he maintained his perfect sitting position. "Sometimes the best way to expose abuse of power is to let someone think they're winning," she smiled. "Rex and I have had a lot of practice being patient." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah could already see the ripple effects beginning. Board members were huddled in worried discussion. Neighbors who had avoided her were now approaching with tentative smiles. And through it all, Rex sat calmly at her side, the very picture of a highly trained police canine. "Well, partner," she said quietly to Rex, "mission accomplished. Ready to get back to real work?" His ears perked up at her tone, and she could have sworn he was smiling too. The HOA violation notices stopped immediately. Karen resigned from the board the next day, citing personal reasons, and if the neighbors noticed that Sarah's grass sometimes grew a quarter-inch too long, nobody said a word. Section 5 Resolution and Impact. The changes in Maple Grove Estates unfolded gradually over the following months. The emergency HOA board meeting, held the day after Karen's confrontation with Sarah, marked the beginning of a community transformation. Board members, eager to distance themselves from Karen's actions, voted unanimously to review all enforcement actions from the past year. The review revealed a disturbing pattern. Karen's selective enforcement hadn't been limited to Sarah. Numerous residents, particularly minorities and single women, had faced similar harassment. Mrs. Chen's wheelchair ramp incident was just one example among many. The documentation Sarah had gathered became a blueprint for identifying systemic discrimination within the HOA's practices. Sarah found herself unexpectedly central to these reforms, though not by choice. "The irony," she told Rex during their morning run, "is that all I wanted was a quiet place for your recovery." But her law enforcement experience proved invaluable as the community worked to establish fair enforcement guidelines. The investigation into Karen's actions expanded beyond the HOA. The police department's Civil Rights Division took a keen interest in the case, using it to develop new training protocols for handling HOA discrimination complaints. Sarah's methodical documentation became a model for other officers dealing with similar situations. Karen herself remained conspicuously absent from community events. Her house went on the market within weeks, marketed by a realtor who specialized in quick, discreet sales. Neighbors whispered about potential legal consequences, but Sarah maintained professional silence about any ongoing. The broader impact reached beyond Maple Grove Estates. Local news coverage caught the attention of state lawmakers, who began examining HOA oversight regulations. Sarah received requests to speak at law enforcement conferences about identifying and documenting patterns of discriminatory behavior. But the most significant changes were visible in the daily life of the community. The atmosphere of fear and rigid conformity began to fade. Mrs. Chen's wheelchair ramp was officially approved. The Wilson teenagers' basketball hoop, long a source of Karen's complaints, remained standing. Even Mr. Thompson's slightly unconventional garden design was allowed to flourish, Rex's reputation underwent a particularly dramatic transformation. The same neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to chat, fascinated by demonstrations of his training. Sarah found herself giving impromptu educational sessions about police canine units, with Rex serving as the perfect ambassador. "It's not just about winning a confrontation," Sarah explained to a group of rookie officers during a training session. "It's about creating lasting change. Sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to let it expose itself." 6 months after the incident, Maple Grove Estates held its first community fair. The event featured a canine unit demonstration, with Rex and Sarah showcasing their partnership. Children who had once been warned about the dangerous dog now watched in awe as Rex navigated obstacle courses and responded to complex commands. The new HOA board, elected with a focus on fairness and transparency, asked Sarah to help develop guidelines for handling resident complaints. "Your experience shows us how not to do things," the new president admitted during a planning meeting. "We want to be part of the solution, not the problem." A year to the day after the confrontation, Sarah sat on her front porch, reviewing a much different kind of HOA notice, an invitation to join the board's advisory committee on community relations. Rex dozed beside her, his position still regulation perfect even in sleep. "What do you think, partner?" she asked, scratching his favorite spot behind the ears. "Ready for a new challenge?" Rex's tail thumped against the porch, and Sarah smiled. The grass in her front yard was exactly a 1/4 inch above regulation height, and not a single complaint had been filed. The morning paper on her lap carried a small but significant headline: "State Legislature passes HOA Reform Bill." Sarah had testified at the hearings, sharing a story and the documentation that proved it. The law now required HOAs to maintain detailed records of enforcement actions and undergo regular audits for discriminatory practices. As she watched her neighbors going about their morning routines, Mrs. Chen gardening with her mother, the Wilson kids shooting hoops, Mr. Thompson tending his unconventional garden, Sarah reflected on how one person's abuse of power had ultimately led to positive change. "Sometimes," she told Rex, who perked up at her voice, "the best way to fight discrimination isn't just about winning the battle. It's about changing the whole system." Rex's alert posture suggested he understood perfectly, as always. A new family was moving in across the street, their moving truck creating the same ripples of curiosity Sarah's had once caused. But this time the neighbors were already heading over with genuine welcomes and offers of help. No clipboards in sight. Sarah stood, straightening her uniform. "Come on, partner. Let's go welcome them to the neighborhood." As they walked across her imperfect but welcome lawn, she knew that some victories went far beyond just winning a fight. They changed entire communities for the better.